My name is Kelsey Rhodes. I'm 29 years old. Until last month, I thought I understood what family meant. My grandmother, Margaret, was my anchor, my safe place, the only one who ever truly saw me. When she passed, I expected grief and mourning, but instead I was met with betrayal. At the will reading, I wasn't even supposed to be in the room. Everything has already been divided, my Aunt Veronica said coldly, making it clear I was unwanted. But when the attorney read the real document, the room fell into stunned silence. When I say my grandmother was my only anchor, I mean it, and it had been that way since childhood. I always felt like an outsider in my own family. My relatives loved to talk about market shares, property deals, and which skyscraper project had their name on it. My Aunt Veronica, my mother's older sister, had married into one of the city's most aggressive real estate families. She crowned herself matriarch after my grandfather's passing and never let anyone forget her supposed authority. My uncle Richard was equally smug, a man whose favorite topics were golf tournaments and political connections. Their children, my cousins, Jordan and Elise, were raised to believe privilege was their birthright. At family gatherings, their designer clothes and smug smiles made me feel like I was on the outside of a velvet rope. Still wearing those department store shoes, Kelsey? Veronica once asked during a Thanksgiving dinner, her tone smooth but cutting. You really should let me take you shopping. Appearances matter. She laughed lightly, pretending it was a joke, but the sting lingered long after the pumpkin pie was served. My mother, Linda, never defended me. She sat quietly, smiling nervously, adjusting her bracelets like she hadn't heard. My father, Robert, a high school history teacher, worked extra shifts tutoring just to keep us afloat, and his exhaustion left him detached. He would shrug off Veronica's remarks as though silence was the best shield. But silence always left me alone in the line of fire. The only safe place in those gatherings was my grandmother's penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan. Margaret Rhodes had lived there for decades, a woman of elegance but also surprising simplicity. While her home gleamed with marble floors and chandeliers, she refused to chase the flashy, shallow games the rest of the family played. I would retreat into her kitchen, with its warm oak cabinets and slightly outdated appliances. There, she told me stories from her youth, how she had married my grandfather when he was just a struggling architect, how they built their lives together with little more than determination and patience. Money can vanish overnight, she would remind me, pressing my hand between hers. Character doesn't. In those moments, I felt seen in a way no one else allowed me to be. Grandma didn't care that I wore thrifted dresses to Christmas dinner or that I chose paperbacks over designer handbags. She noticed things like how I stayed late to help her clean after parties or how I listened more than I spoke. Where the rest of my family viewed me as a disappointment, Grandma Margaret saw me as something different, someone worth her time, her trust, and eventually, something more than I ever could have imagined. As I got older, the gap between me and the rest of my family only widened. While my cousins followed carefully paved tracks into law school, MBA programs, and lucrative internships at real estate firms, I chose a different road. At 22, when the question of careers hovered over every dinner conversation, I announced that I was interning at a nonprofit focused on affordable housing. The silence at the table was almost comical. Then came the laughter. That's cute, Uncle Richard chuckled, swirling his wine. But when you're ready for a real career, we'll find you a spot in the family business. Charity doesn't pay the bills, dear, Aunt Veronica added, her voice dripping with condescension. You'll grow out of this little phase. But I wasn't in a phase. I had found purpose. The long days of organizing food drives, writing grant proposals, and meeting families who just needed a chance, it gave me a sense of worth their skyscrapers and cocktail parties never could. My parents stayed quiet. Dad muttered something about being proud, though his eyes revealed worry about money. Mom shifted uneasily, torn between her loyalty to me and her fear of crossing Veronica. Grandma Margaret, though, leaned across the table and smiled at me. The world has enough people chasing dollars, she said softly, cutting through the noise. What it needs is more people chasing change. What no one else knew was that she was quietly helping me. When my tuition bills piled higher than my meager paycheck, an envelope would arrive with just enough to keep me afloat. Later, when I worked long hours at a shelter downtown, the organization received anonymous donations that matched exactly the causes I had been fighting for. I suspected, but never asked, because I already knew. Over the years, while my family curated social media posts posing with Grandma in her penthouse, it was me she invited into her sunroom for tea and conversations about philosophy, politics, and hope. She wasn't just supporting me financially. She was passing me her torch. By the time I was 26, I had carved out a modest place for myself in Chicago's nonprofit world. I was working as a program director at a housing advocacy organization, coordinating community workshops, negotiating with local officials, and pushing for policy change. It wasn't glamorous, and the pay barely covered rent on my tiny apartment, but it felt meaningful. Each family that managed to secure safe housing reminded me why I'd chosen this path. Every time a lease was signed or a grant proposal approved, I felt like I was honoring the values my grandmother had instilled in me. And despite the long hours, I never stopped my weekly visits to her penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan. The rhythm of those afternoons sustained me, walking into her sunroom, placing 2 mugs of tea on the small table, and hearing her stories about the city in the 1960s, or about the early years with my grandfather when they could barely afford groceries. She listened to my own stories just as eagerly, nodding along as I described board meetings and fundraising battles. In her presence, I felt the grounding I rarely found anywhere else. It was during one of those visits that I first noticed the tremor in her hands. She was pouring tea, and the liquid splashed slightly over the rim of the cup. "Grandma, are you all right?" I asked, alarmed. She smiled gently, brushing it off. "Just old age catching up with me, sweetheart. Don't worry." But I did worry. Over the following weeks, the signs became undeniable. Her steps grew slower. She grew tired after a few minutes of conversation. When she finally admitted she had been diagnosed with congestive heart failure, I felt the ground shift beneath me. The prognosis was uncertain, maybe years, maybe only months. News spread quickly through the family, and suddenly relatives who hadn't set foot in her penthouse for years reappeared as though on cue. Veronica, in particular, wasted no time asserting herself as the rightful decision-maker. "We simply must move Mother into a private care facility," she announced one evening during what was supposed to be a small birthday gathering. The dining table had been filled with relatives I barely recognized, and even some of Richard's business partners who had no business being there. Grandma, regal even in her frailty, shook her head. "I am perfectly comfortable here. Kelsey has arranged for a nurse to visit daily, and that is sufficient." The look Veronica shot me across the table could have sliced glass. "Kelsey seems to think she knows best for everyone these days," she said coldly. "Tell me, dear niece, what medical qualifications do you have?" "None?" I thought so. I could feel the heat rising in my face, but I forced my voice steady. I consulted her doctors. They recommended she stay in familiar surroundings, where she's comfortable. "How convenient," Veronica snapped, her smile brittle. "How very convenient that their recommendations align perfectly with your supposed control over the situation." My mother stared at her lap, silent. My father mumbled something about calming down. But the rest of the room turned on me like a pack sensing weakness. Uncle Richard chimed in that my nonprofit work was just an excuse for laziness. Jordan accused me of trying to brainwash Grandma. Elise rolled her eyes so hard I thought she'd strain a muscle. I held my ground, but from that evening forward, the smear campaign began in earnest. Veronica called distant cousins and painted me as an opportunist. She whispered to Grandma's friends that I was isolating her. By the time I arrived for one of my usual visits, the new nurse stopped me at the door. "Your aunt thinks it would be best to schedule visits through her," she said stiffly. Heartbroken, I switched to phone calls, though even those became shorter as Grandma's energy faded. Then, one quiet afternoon about 3 months before she passed, she gripped my hand with sudden urgency. "Kelsey, there's something in the attic I want you to have," she whispered. "A wooden box with brass corners, in the far corner under the eaves. It has memories. And the key. The key is important." Don't let anyone else take it. I promised I would. The next week, when I arrived to see her, Uncle Richard blocked me at the door. She's too tired, he said flatly. Go home. I tried again the following week. Same excuse. The week after, I came early in the morning, hoping to slip in before Veronica arrived. The night nurse, a kind woman named Rachel, gave me a sympathetic look. She asks about you, she admitted softly. I can give you 15 minutes, but if anyone sees you here, I'll deny it. I crept upstairs and found Grandma asleep. Not wanting to wake her, I climbed to the attic. Dust clung to the air, and the wooden beams groaned under my steps. In the far corner, just where she'd said, I found the box. Heavy, with brass corners, it smelled faintly of cedar. I opened it just enough to see bundles of letters, faded photographs, and a small brass key tied to a ribbon. My heart pounded. I slipped the box into my bag just as I heard voices downstairs. Veronica had arrived early. I snuck out through the service entrance, planning to return the next week and show Grandma what I had found. But that chance never came. 2 weeks later, Mom called me with a hushed voice. Your grandmother's been taken to the hospital. 3 days after that, she was gone. I never got to say goodbye. The wooden box stayed hidden in my apartment, unopened. Something told me it wasn't meant to be touched until after she was gone. At the time, I couldn't know just how right that instinct would prove to be. The message reached me by accident. A cousin, Elise, sent a group text, "We're reading at Grandma's penthouse Thursday, 8 p.m., dress formal." Just a moment later, another message followed, "Oops, wrong group." Wrong group. As if I wasn't supposed to be there. As if my own grandmother's final words weren't meant for me. I stared at the glowing screen in disbelief, then anger. They hadn't invited me. Not officially, not directly, not in any decent way. But Margaret Rhodes had been my grandmother too, and whatever my relatives thought of me, I wasn't about to be erased from her story. Thursday came bitterly warm for October. The golden haze of autumn hung over Lake Michigan, the kind of day Grandma always loved, when the water looked like glass and the city skyline gleamed like polished steel. I put on my black dress, the same one I had worn to countless charity dinners, paired with pearl earrings Grandma had given me at my college graduation. My decade-old Toyota felt out of place pulling up beside Veronica's Mercedes and Richard's glossy BMW, but I didn't care. The butler, Graham, opened the door with raised brows. "Miss Rhodes. I was not told you'd be attending." "I'm family, Graham," I said, forcing my voice steady. "I belong here." He hesitated, then stepped aside. Inside, the air reeked of expensive perfume and strained politeness. Relatives filled the sitting room, dressed in dark suits and sleek dresses, voices dropping the moment they saw me. Elisa's face drained of color. Jordan muttered something under his breath and slipped out of the room, no doubt to find his mother. I hadn't crossed halfway into the room when Aunt Veronica stormed toward me, heels clicking like gunshots against marble. Her expression was composed fury. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice sharp enough to slice glass. "This is my grandmother too," I answered evenly. "I have as much right to be here as anyone." She laughed, short, cruel, echoing off the high ceiling. "Family? You abandoned this family years ago when you chose your little charity hobby over a real career. You manipulated Mother when she was weak. You don't belong here." Murmurs rippled through the room. Some relatives smirked. Others looked uncomfortable but said nothing. "I never manipulated her," I shot back, cheeks burning. "I loved her. I spent time with her. Which is more than most of you can say." Gasps and whispers erupted. Veronica's face hardened. "We already divided everything according to what she wanted. You were excluded for good reason." Before I could reply, she pulled out her phone and barked into it. Minutes later, a man in a security uniform appeared. "Escort her out," she ordered coolly. The humiliation was crushing. No one defended me. My mother looked at her shoes, my father at the floor. Even cousins I'd once played with as a child avoided my gaze. Tears burned my eyes, but I forced myself to hold my head high. "Grandma would be ashamed of you," I said, voice trembling, before walking out. I had barely reached my car when my phone buzzed again. A message from an unfamiliar number. "Wait there. Don't leave. Daniel Price, attorney." I froze. Grandma's lawyer? 5 minutes later, a tall man with salt and pepper hair approached, carrying a leather briefcase. He introduced himself with a firm handshake. I was Margaret's attorney for over 20 years. I apologize for what just happened inside. I arrived late and found them conducting an unofficial reading. His voice dripped with professional disapproval. "They said everything was already divided," I murmured bitterly. He shook his head. "Impossible. Nothing can be divided until I conduct the official reading. Whatever they told you isn't legal or binding." A flicker of hope sparked inside me. "Then what happens now?" Daniel opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder. "Before we return, you should know, your name is the only one listed as primary beneficiary." The words hung in the air like thunder. I blinked at him, certain I had misheard. "What? That can't be right. What about my mother? My aunt? Everyone else?" "There are stipulations and minor conditional gifts," he clarified. "But the estate, her penthouse, investments, accounts, everything, she left to you." I staggered back, my breath caught in my throat. My grandmother had left me her entire estate. Not Veronica, not Richard, not my cousins. Me. Daniel studied my expression gently. She anticipated this would cause conflict. That's why she gave me explicit instructions. She was of sound mind and had her competency verified 3 separate times. "This will is airtight." I looked down at the folder he held out. My name leapt from the page. "I, Margaret Elaine Rhodes, being of sound mind, do hereby bequeath the entirety of my estate to my granddaughter, Kelsey Marie Rhodes." The reality hit me like a wave. Grandma had entrusted me, with everything she had built. "Are you ready to go back inside?" Daniel asked. "It won't be pleasant. But it must be done properly." I swallowed hard. Part of me wanted to run, to escape the storm I knew was waiting behind those polished glass doors. But another part, the part Grandma had nurtured in me, knew I couldn't walk away. I squared my shoulders and nodded. Together we walked back into the penthouse. The room fell silent at the sight of us. Veronica's eyes widened, then narrowed into a glare. Richard stiffened, sensing trouble. My cousins exchanged worried looks. "What is this?" Veronica snapped. "We asked her to leave." "And I asked her to return," Daniel said smoothly. "As executor of Margaret Rhodes' last will and testament, I cannot proceed without all relevant parties present." "Relevant?" Richard repeated, voice sharp. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Daniel placed his briefcase on the ornate coffee table. "It means we are about to begin the official will reading. Whatever discussions you had earlier were premature and non-binding." The air in the room shifted instantly. Some relatives paled. Others bristled. Veronica's face went stiff with fury beneath her perfectly applied makeup. As everyone reluctantly sat down, Daniel caught my eye and gave me a subtle nod. My pulse raced, but I felt something I hadn't in years: validation. For the first time that evening, I believed I truly belonged in that room. The silence in the penthouse was almost unbearable as Daniel opened his leather briefcase and slipped on his reading glasses. The weight of the moment pressed on everyone. I could hear the faint tick of the grandfather clock in the corner, each second stretching into eternity. My relatives shifted in their seats, Veronica glaring daggers at me, Richard scowling, Elise and Jordan whispering behind perfectly manicured hands. "This is the last will and testament of Margaret Elaine Rhodes," Daniel began, his voice steady, carrying the solemn authority of years in courtrooms. "Dated April 22nd of this year, witnessed by myself and Dr. Leonard Harris." April 22nd. My mind flashed back. It was only days after that disastrous birthday dinner where Veronica had tried to undermine me in front of Grandma. Margaret had already been fading, but her mind was as sharp as ever. I remembered her squeezing my hand that night, her eyes steady and full of unspoken resolve. Now I understood why. Daniel paused, scanning the room. Before I read the distributions, Mrs. Rhodes requested that a personal statement be delivered in full. Is that really necessary? Veronica interrupted sharply. We all knew Mother. Just get to the relevant parts. Daniel lowered his glasses and fixed her with a look that silenced even her. Mrs. Rhodes was very clear. Her words are to be read as written. This is a legal proceeding, not a casual gathering. Veronica huffed, crossing her arms. Daniel continued, reading from the parchment with deliberate clarity. To my family gathered here today, throughout my 85 years, I have come to understand that the true measure of wealth lies not in what we accumulate, but in how we choose to share it. Money and possessions mean little if they do not serve a greater purpose. For many years, I have watched with growing concern as certain members of this family became increasingly consumed by status and appearances, often at the expense of kindness and authenticity. I have seen compassion mistaken for weakness, generosity viewed with suspicion, and love treated as a transaction. One person, however, never faltered. One person gave me her time, her care, her loyalty, not because she expected anything in return, but because it was who she was. For this reason, I have chosen to entrust her with what I have built. The air went razor sharp. Eyes turned toward me, some full of disbelief, others seething with realization. My chest tightened. I hereby bequeath, Daniel read, the entirety of my estate, including the Lake Michigan penthouse, all financial assets, investments, and personal property, to my granddaughter, Kelsey Marie Rhodes. The explosion was instant. This is outrageous. Veronica shot to her feet, her face twisted with rage. She obviously manipulated Mother in her weakest state. This is illegal, Richard barked, slamming a fist on the table. His face turned crimson. Margaret was not in her right mind. We will contest this immediately. Jordan shouted something about betrayal. Elise covered her mouth in dramatic sobs, whispering about being cut out. Distant relatives muttered in confusion, unsure whether to be angry or simply stunned. I sat frozen, my pulse hammering in my ears. Grandma had left me everything. The penthouse. The fortune. The empire she had quietly managed behind the scenes. It was overwhelming, terrifying even, but it was also undeniable. Daniel remained calm, waiting for the outburst to subside. He raised his hand slightly. If I may continue, there are additional stipulations. The room gradually quieted. Even Veronica leaned forward, eyes narrowing. While the estate is left in its entirety to Kelsey Rhodes, Daniel read, Mrs. Rhodes established conditional bequests to other family members. These conditions are based on the treatment of Kelsey, both prior to Margaret's death and in the aftermath of this will reading. Mrs. Rhodes kept detailed records, including correspondence and observations, and she employed independent investigators to document certain incidents. The silence that followed was absolute. My heart thudded in my chest. Investigators? Grandma had gone that far? Veronica sneered. So she spied on us? She protected her granddaughter, Daniel corrected smoothly. And based on what I have witnessed here tonight, her concerns were valid. He flipped to another document. For example, on March 14, Mrs. Rhodes specifically requested a visit from Kelsey. Records show that Veronica Rhodes instructed staff to deny her access. Dr. Harris's notes confirm that Mrs. Rhodes was alert and in good spirits that day, and that family visits were recommended. Gasps circled the room. Veronica's face drained of color before she quickly recovered. Mother was confused. She needed rest. Kelsey would have upset her. Daniel didn't flinch. The medical documentation contradicts your claim. My throat tightened. Grandma had known. She hadn't been fooled by their whispers and manipulations. She had recorded everything. Daniel read on. Mrs. Rhodes established a trust of $5 million to be distributed among family members who met her criteria. These criteria included respect for Kelsey, support for her career choices, inclusion in family events, and refraining from disparaging remarks about her character. Based on my review of the documentation, I regret to inform you that none of the individuals present currently qualify for these distributions. The room erupted again, louder than before. Shouts overlapped, accusations hurled at me, at Daniel, even at Grandma herself. You're a liar. Elise screamed through tears. She manipulated everything. Richard bellowed. This will never stand up in court. Veronica declared, her voice shrill. Through it all, Daniel stood firm. Mrs. Rhodes anticipated these reactions. She had her competency evaluated 3 separate times during the drafting of this will. This document is legally bulletproof. The shouting slowed, though the fury didn't fade. My mother sat in the corner, tears streaming down her cheeks. She hadn't spoken a word, but the guilt in her expression was almost unbearable. Our eyes met, and she looked away. Finally, Daniel turned back to me. Mrs. Rhodes left you a personal letter as well. Would you like to receive it now, or in private? All eyes drilled into me. I swallowed hard, my voice barely audible. Later. Please. Daniel nodded respectfully and set the envelope aside. He cleared his throat. One final note. The conditional bequests remain available for 1 year. Mrs. Rhodes hoped reconciliation would be possible, though she left the terms entirely in Kelsey's hands. That last sentence landed like a stone in the pit of my stomach. Suddenly, every calculating gaze shifted toward me. In the space of an hour, I had gone from family outcast to sole heir, and now, arbiter of their financial futures. The weight of it was crushing. But somewhere deep inside, beneath the fear and the anger, a spark of strength flared. Grandma had trusted me. And now, I had to decide what to do with that trust. The chaos of the will reading carried on long after Daniel closed his folder. My relatives swarmed around him, voices overlapping, threats spilling into the air like poison. Veronica shouted about contesting the will. Richard demanded copies of the documents. Elise sobbed dramatically, while Jordan muttered that I had somehow orchestrated all of this. I sat back in my chair, numb, unable to process the storm that had swallowed the room. When I finally pushed myself to stand, hoping to escape, I felt a hand on my arm. My mother. Her eyes were swollen from crying, her makeup smeared, her expression torn between shame and something that looked like desperation. Kelsey, she whispered, glancing around nervously. Please, can we talk, just the two of us? I hesitated. Years of silence hung heavy between us. Silence at family dinners when Veronica insulted me. Silence when I was cut out of gatherings. Silence when Grandma was dying and I was denied access. And now she wanted to talk. Still, something in her trembling voice made me nod. I followed her into a small music room off the main hallway. The grand piano sat silent in the corner, its lid gathering dust. I remembered Grandma playing there when I was a child, her fingers dancing over the keys while I sat on the bench beside her. Now, the room felt like a mausoleum for everything we had lost. As soon as the door closed, my mother broke down. I'm so sorry, Kelsey. I should have protected you. I should have been stronger. The words sliced through me, reopening old wounds. Then why didn't you? My voice cracked, but the anger was real. All those years, you let them tear me apart. You let them treat me like garbage. You stood by and said nothing. She sank onto the piano bench, shoulders collapsing. I was afraid. After I married your father, Veronica made it clear my place in the family depended on obedience. When you chose your own path, when you refused to follow their rules, I didn't know how to defend you without losing everything myself. You chose them over me, I whispered, my throat tight. Your own daughter. I thought, she paused, shaking her head as tears slid down her cheeks. I thought I could protect you better by staying in their good graces. If I pushed back, they would have cut us off completely. But they did anyway, didn't they? Yes, I said coldly. They cut me off from Grandma when she was dying. Did you know about that? Her face crumpled. I suspected. Veronica told me the doctors wanted peace and quiet. I should have questioned it. I should have fought harder. I failed you, Kelsey. The admission hit me harder than I expected. For years, I had convinced myself she didn't care. Now, watching her break apart, I realized she did, but she had been too weak, too afraid, to stand up for me. We sat in silence, the only sound the muffled arguments echoing from the sitting room down the hall. Finally, she reached for my hand. I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I want you to know, I have always loved you. I have always been proud of you, even when I was too cowardly to say it. Part of me wanted to pull away, to protect myself with the anger that had shielded me for so long. But another part, the part Grandma had nurtured, recognized the sincerity in her eyes. I need time, I said quietly. This is too much to process right now. She nodded. I understand. Just, don't shut me out completely. When we left the music room, the atmosphere in the penthouse had shifted. Some relatives were already storming out, muttering about lawyers. Others lingered, whispering to each other in corners. Daniel stood near the door speaking with Graham, the butler. When he saw me, he approached. Miss Rhodes, he said softly, there's something else you should know. Your grandmother instructed me to remind you about a wooden box. I believe you already have it. My heart skipped. Yes. I took it from the attic months ago. Good, Daniel said. She wanted you to review its contents before making any decisions regarding the conditional bequests. I nodded, my pulse quickening. That box had sat untouched in my apartment for weeks, hidden in the back of my closet. I had resisted opening it, waiting for the right moment. Perhaps this was it. That night, back in my small apartment, I placed the box on my kitchen table. For a long time, I just stared at it, tracing the brass corners with my fingertips. Finally, I took a deep breath and lifted the lid. Inside were neatly bundled letters, tied with faded ribbons. Photographs, some black and white, others yellowed with age, lay stacked beside them. At the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, was the brass key Grandma had mentioned. My chest tightened as I sifted through the contents. The first letters were love notes, addressed to my grandmother from a man who wasn't my grandfather. My breath caught as I read the affectionate words, the longing etched into every sentence. One photograph showed them together, young and radiant, their faces glowing with happiness. The man's arm was wrapped around her waist, their smiles intimate. In a journal tucked beneath the letters, Grandma confessed the truth. He had been her first love, the one her parents disapproved of. She had chosen security and social acceptance instead, marrying my grandfather. It is my greatest regret, she had written in shaky handwriting. I chose safety over love, appearances over truth. I hope Kelsey never repeats my mistake. Tears blurred my vision. My grandmother, the woman who had seemed so strong, so untouchable, had carried a secret heartbreak her entire life. But there was more. Beneath the journal were folders of detailed notes documenting my family's behavior. Times when Veronica intercepted my calls. Instances when relatives excluded me from gatherings. Even transcripts of conversations with nurses who had been instructed to keep me away. The most damning evidence was a string of printed emails between Veronica and the daytime nurse. We cannot allow Kelsey to influence Mother during this vulnerable period. Financial matters are being settled. Her presence is problematic. My stomach churned as I read. They hadn't just ignored me, they had deliberately shut me out. They had stolen my last weeks with Grandma. By the time I set the papers down, my hands were trembling. The truth was undeniable. Grandma had known exactly what was happening. She had seen through their lies, their greed, their cruelty. And she had left me not just her fortune, but the proof I needed to face them. For the first time that night, as grief and fury mingled in my chest, I felt something new rising within me, resolve. They thought they had won by keeping me away. But Grandma had outplayed them all. In the days that followed, the weight of the inheritance pressed on me like a stone. Every call from Daniel, every letter stamped with the Rhodes name, reminded me that Grandma hadn't simply handed me wealth, she'd handed me responsibility. The conditional bequests she left to the rest of the family were technically mine to decide. I could grant them access or deny it entirely. For a while, I considered refusing them all outright. After everything they had done, why should I give them a cent? But every night, I found myself sitting at my kitchen table with that wooden box open, rereading Grandma's journal entries. Her words weren't angry, even when she described the cruelty I had endured. They were firm, hopeful. She wanted reconciliation, even if she doubted it was possible. And in one passage, written shakily in her final year, she left me a challenge: do not let bitterness guide you. If they are to receive anything, let it come through lessons in compassion. That is the only currency that endures. So 2 weeks after the will reading, I called the family together at the penthouse. Everyone came. Veronica arrived first, her heels clicking sharply on marble, followed by Richard with his briefcase, as if he were preparing for negotiations. Elise and Jordan lingered behind them, avoiding my gaze. My mother walked in quietly, her shoulders hunched, though she gave me the faintest nod of encouragement. We gathered in the sitting room where so much venom had been spilled just days earlier. I stood at the center, my palms sweating, my heart pounding, but I kept my voice steady. Thank you all for coming. I've reviewed Grandma's documents. I've read her notes. And I've thought long and hard about what she wanted. A heavy silence. Veronica leaned back, arms crossed. Get on with it. I drew in a breath. The conditional bequests remain on the table. But they come with an additional requirement. Each of you must complete 500 hours of verified volunteer work at organizations Grandma supported. Housing shelters, immigrant aid programs, food banks. Only then will you qualify for any portion. The room erupted instantly. 500 hours? Richard scoffed. That's insane. I have a career. Elise snapped. This is just another way for you to control us, Jordan accused, his face twisted with anger. No, I said firmly, cutting through the noise. This is about honoring Grandma's values. She gave her life to compassion in secret. Now, if you want a share of what she left, you'll have to show you've learned what that means. Veronica's laugh was sharp, bitter. You don't get to dictate terms to us. Yes, I do, I replied, my voice steadying with every word. Grandma gave me that right. You can accept it or walk away. The choice is yours. The shouting resumed, but I no longer felt small beneath it. I stood taller, stronger, hearing Grandma's voice in my memory: money can vanish overnight. Character doesn't. For the first time, I understood she had left me more than her estate. She had left me the power to change the terms of what it meant to be a Rhodes. The silence that followed my announcement lasted only seconds before the room fractured into chaos. My words, 500 hours of volunteer work, hit them like a grenade. The same people who spent their lives managing deals, contracts, and property portfolios suddenly lost all composure. Richard was the first to bark, his voice booming. 500 hours? That's over 12 full work weeks. You can't seriously expect professionals like us to waste time handing out soup or folding blankets. This is absurd, Elise spat, her eyes flashing. Do you have any idea what my schedule looks like? I have clients, responsibilities, a life. Jordan leaned forward, his tone dripping venom. This isn't about Grandma. This is about you trying to control us. Admit it, you want to make us grovel. The accusations flew like arrows. I stood in the center of the storm, every word meant to pierce me, to drag me back into the role of the unwanted outsider. But for once, I didn't shrink. I remembered Grandma's journals, the notes she had left, her plea not to let bitterness guide me. So I held my ground. This isn't about control, I said firmly, raising my voice above theirs. This is about honoring Grandma's values. She spent her life quietly supporting people who had nothing. If you want a share of what she left, then prove you understand what she believed in. Utter nonsense. Veronica finally exploded, her carefully constructed poise cracking. She stood, hands clenched at her sides. Mother never would have agreed to this. She valued hard work and success. Not wasting time on people who can't help themselves. Daniel, still seated in the corner, adjusted his glasses and spoke for the first time since my announcement. Mrs. Rhodes was very clear about her wishes. Her notes, her documentation, and the trust itself all indicate that Kelsey has full discretion. You may disagree with her terms, but they are legally enforceable. The fury in the room escalated. Richard threatened lawsuits again. Elise muttered that she'd never speak to me after this. Jordan slammed his fist against the table and stormed toward the door. One by one, the others followed, slamming the heavy oak doors behind them, their perfume and cologne lingering like smoke after a fire. And just like that, the storm was over. The room was empty except for Daniel, myself, and my mother. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't left. She sat quietly in the corner, her hands folded in her lap, tears streaking down her cheeks. When the last echoes faded, she stood and walked toward me. For once, her steps weren't hesitant. "I'll do it," she said simply. Her words caught me off guard. "You don't have to," I said carefully. "Not for the money." She shook her head. "Not for the money. For you. For her. I know I failed you, Kelsey. I stayed silent when I should have spoken. I let them treat you like an outsider, and I did nothing. I can't change the past, but I can try now. If volunteering is the path to honoring your grandmother, then that's the path I'll take." I searched her face, waiting for a trace of calculation, a glimmer of the old fear that always guided her. But it wasn't there. For the first time, I saw resolve in her eyes, quiet, fragile, but real. The lump in my throat made it hard to speak. "It's not about earning her approval anymore," I whispered. "It's about finding your own." She smiled weakly. "Maybe it's about both." We stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of years of distance pressing between us. And yet, in that silence, something shifted. A bridge, fragile but present, began to take shape. When she left the penthouse that evening, I lingered in the empty sitting room. The grandeur of the space, once filled with shouting and venom, now felt strangely hollow. But for the first time, I didn't feel small in it. Grandma had given me the power to demand respect, to set terms, to draw lines no one had ever allowed me before. The others had stormed out in fury, but one had stayed. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start something new. 5 months passed, carrying with them a whirlwind of changes I could never have imagined back on that night when Veronica tried to throw me out of the penthouse. In those early days, I moved between exhaustion and disbelief. Managing an estate worth millions while running a non-profit background was like stepping into an entirely new world. Every day was filled with contracts, legal documents, investment reports, and board meetings with people who had once dismissed me as nothing more than the charity case of the Rhodes family. But Daniel guided me with a steady hand. Patient, meticulous, he explained every step, every number, every clause. "Your grandmother prepared you more than you realize," he told me once over coffee. "She built this portfolio with intention, ethical investments, sustainable ventures, philanthropic partnerships. She wanted you to carry her vision forward, not just sit on the wealth." Those words became my compass. I established the Rhodes Foundation for Housing Equity, using the penthouse as its headquarters. The grand sitting rooms that once hosted cold, judgmental family dinners were converted into meeting spaces for community partners. The garden overlooking Lake Michigan opened to the public one weekend each month, hosting literacy programs and youth workshops. The guest suites, where my cousins used to lounge during holidays, became temporary residences for families transitioning out of shelters. Every corner of the penthouse was reimagined to reflect the values Grandma had lived quietly but fiercely. Letters began pouring in once word spread about the foundation. Former students who had received scholarships from anonymous donors, scholarships I now knew were funded by Grandma, wrote to share how their lives had been changed. A woman thanked us for the medical grant that had saved her daughter's life. A small business owner recounted how a microloan had allowed her to build a bakery that now employed 20 people. Dozens of voices, once strangers, revealed that Margaret Rhodes had been their hidden benefactor. Reading those letters at night, I felt closer to her than ever before. She had worn the mask of a wealthy matriarch to satisfy family expectations, but behind it she had lived a second life as a quiet force of compassion. And now, she had given me the freedom to continue that secret legacy in the open. My relationship with my mother shifted as well. True to her word, she committed to the volunteer requirement, choosing a literacy program for immigrant families. At first, she approached it with hesitation, still wrapped in the habits of status and appearances. But over time, something softened in her. She came to our Sunday brunches with stories about the children she worked with, her eyes alight in ways I hadn't seen since my childhood. One afternoon, she admitted, "I never knew helping others could feel this fulfilling. Your grandmother must have known it would change me too." I smiled through tears. She always knew more than she let on. The rest of the family remained fractured. Veronica and Richard pursued their threat of contesting the will, dragging me into a brief but bitter legal battle. But Grandma had been meticulous. 3 separate mental competency evaluations, airtight legal documentation, even investigators' reports. There was no crack in the armor she had built. Eventually, their case collapsed. They withdrew in humiliation, cutting off all contact. Elise and Jordan followed their parents' example, retreating into silence and resentment. Not all bridges were burned, though. One day, Elise, quiet, often overlooked, approached me with a shaky voice. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said. "But I've been thinking about Grandma. I want to understand what she valued. I'd like to volunteer." Skepticism gnawed at me, but sincerity glimmered in her eyes. Slowly, cautiously, I agreed. Over the following months, she became a regular presence at a youth arts program the foundation supported. Trust came slowly, but for the first time, I saw that maybe Grandma's hope for reconciliation wasn't entirely in vain. The biggest transformation, though, was within me. For years, I had carried the weight of being less than, the poor cousin, the charity case, the one who didn't fit the Rhodes mold. But now, standing at the heart of a foundation that bore our name, I realized I wasn't just living in Grandma's shadow. I was carrying her torch. On the 1-year anniversary of her passing, I hosted a community dinner in the penthouse dining hall. The same room that once held icy holiday gatherings now overflowed with laughter, music, and warmth. Volunteers sat beside families they had served. Local leaders shared tables with young students. Conversations crossed boundaries of wealth, culture, and background. I stood at the head of the room, looking around at the sea of faces, and felt Grandma's presence so strongly it almost stole my breath. When Daniel raised his glass for a toast, his voice cracked slightly. To Margaret Rhodes, who knew that the true value of wealth lies not in what we keep, but in how we share it. To Margaret, the room echoed. Later, as the last guests departed and I stepped into the garden under a sky full of stars, I whispered a promise into the cool night air: "I will use what you gave me wisely. I will not forget the true purpose of privilege. I will lift others up, as you always did." For the first time since her passing, the weight on my shoulders felt lighter. Not gone, but transformed into something I could carry with pride. Grandma had given me more than money. She had given me freedom, the freedom to choose compassion over greed, truth over appearances, love over fear. And that freedom was the legacy I would carry for the rest of my life. If you were handed an unexpected fortune along with the burden of mending broken family ties, how would you handle it? Would you see it as a tool for power, or as a chance to rebuild trust? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story touched you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and pass it along to someone who could use a reminder that real wealth isn't in what we own, but in how we treat one another. Thanks for being part of this journey toward healing and hope.